It was supposed to be a routine sentencing hearing. Judge Margaret Thompson sat behind the bench, reviewing the case file of Sarah Mitchell, a 30-year-old woman convicted of embezzlement from her employer. Open and shut case. 2 years minimum sentence. But when Sarah stood to address the court, she pulled up her sleeve and revealed a scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow. "Your Honor, I need to show you something. 25 years ago, someone saved my life. I was 5 years old, trapped in a burning car after an accident. A stranger pulled me out and stayed with me until the ambulance came. I never knew her name, but she had kind eyes and told me everything would be okay." Margaret's hands began to tremble as she gripped the gavel. She remembered that night, the snow, the twisted metal, the little girl's screams. She had been a law student then, driving home from the library, and she had never told anyone about stopping to help. The woman standing before her was that little girl, and Margaret had to sentence her to prison. What happened next would expose a secret Margaret had kept for 25 years, and force both women to confront the meaning of justice, mercy, and the invisible threads that bind strangers together across time. Before we dive deep into this incredible story, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the very end because this story will challenge everything you think you know about right and wrong. Judge Margaret Thompson had built her entire career on the foundation of law and order. At 47 years old, she had spent the last 15 years on the bench of the Superior Court of Massachusetts, earning a reputation as fair but firm. Defense attorneys respected her. Prosecutors knew better than to come to her courtroom unprepared, and defendants learned quickly that Judge Thompson didn't accept excuses or sob stories. The law was the law, and Margaret believed in its power to create order from chaos, justice from wrongdoing. Her courtroom was her sanctuary, a place where everything made sense because everything followed rules. Rules she understood, rules she could control, rules that never betrayed her the way people did. Margaret lived alone in a modest but elegant townhouse in Cambridge. She had never married, never had children, and kept her personal life meticulously separate from her professional one. Her colleagues knew almost nothing about her past beyond her impressive academic credentials and her meteoric rise through the legal system. She preferred it that way. The less people knew, the fewer questions they asked. And Margaret Thompson had spent 25 years making sure no one asked the wrong questions. The morning of Sarah Mitchell's sentencing hearing began like any other. Margaret arrived at the courthouse at 7:30, an hour before her first case. She reviewed her calendar over coffee in her chambers, noting that she had 3 hearings scheduled for the day. The Mitchell case was the last one, set for 3 o'clock. Margaret pulled the file and scanned the details. Sarah Mitchell, age 30, single mother of 1 daughter, had been working as an accountant for a small medical supply company when she was caught embezzling $75,000 over an 18-month period. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, forged documents, digital trails that prosecutors had followed with ease. Sarah had pleaded guilty, which meant Margaret's job today was simply to determine the length of her sentence. The prosecution was recommending 4 years. The defense was asking for probation and restitution. Margaret already knew what her decision would be. Embezzlement was a serious crime, a betrayal of trust that undermined the foundation of business relationships. Sarah Mitchell had stolen money while her employers trusted her with their financial records. That deserved punishment, not leniency. 2 years minimum, possibly 3 depending on how the defendant presented herself during the hearing. At 3 o'clock, Margaret entered the courtroom and took her seat behind the bench. The space was familiar and comforting, with its dark wood paneling, high ceilings, and the seal of Massachusetts mounted on the wall behind her chair. This was her domain, where her word was law. Sarah Mitchell sat at the defense table with her attorney, a young public defender named James Rodriguez, who looked barely old enough to have passed the bar exam. Sarah herself was thin, with dark circles under her eyes and hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a modest blue dress that looked like it might have been borrowed for the occasion. Everything about her screamed of someone life had beaten down, someone who had made bad choices and was about to pay for them. Margaret called the hearing to order and asked Sarah to stand. This was the moment when defendants were given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, to explain themselves, to beg for mercy. Margaret had heard every variation of these speeches. The claims of innocence despite guilty pleas, the promises to do better, the tears and apologies that rarely seemed genuine. She had learned long ago to listen politely, and then render the sentence she had already decided was appropriate. Sarah stood, and Margaret noticed her hands were shaking. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what I did was wrong. I'm not going to stand here and make excuses for my actions. I stole money from people who trusted me, and I have to live with that shame for the rest of my life." Margaret nodded slightly, appreciating at least that Sarah wasn't wasting the court's time with denials. "But I want to explain why I did it, not to justify it, but so you might understand. 3 years ago, my daughter Emma was diagnosed with leukemia. She was 2 years old. The treatments were expensive, and even with insurance I was drowning in medical bills. I was working 2 jobs, barely sleeping, spending every free moment at the hospital. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was desperate." Margaret had heard similar stories before. Medical debt was a common justification for financial crimes. It was sympathetic, certainly, but it didn't change the facts. The law couldn't bend every time someone had a sick child. If it did, there would be no law at all. "I made the worst decision of my life," Sarah continued. "I started taking money from the company, just small amounts at first, telling myself I would pay it back when Emma got better. But the treatments kept getting more expensive, and I kept taking more. By the time I was caught, I had stolen $75,000. Money I knew I could never repay." She paused, and Margaret could see tears forming in her eyes. Another common element of these speeches. The tears rarely moved her anymore. "Emma is in remission now," Sarah said. "She's 5 years old, healthy, and the doctors say her prognosis is excellent. She gets to live because of those treatments. Treatments I paid for with stolen money. I know that doesn't make it right. I know I deserve to be punished. But Your Honor, I'm asking you to consider probation instead of prison. Not for my sake, but for my daughter's. She's already lost so much time with me while she was sick. If I go to prison, she'll spend her childhood visiting me behind glass, and she'll grow up knowing her mother is a criminal." Margaret was about to respond with her standard speech about how the court sympathized with difficult circumstances, but could not allow personal hardship to override the law, when Sarah did something unexpected. She pushed up the sleeve of her dress, revealing her left forearm. A long jagged scar ran from her wrist almost to her elbow, raised and pink against her pale skin. "Your Honor, I need to show you something," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "This scar, I got it 25 years ago. I was 5 years old, and I was in a terrible car accident with my mother. We hit ice on the highway and crashed into a tree. The car caught fire, and I was trapped in the back seat. My mother was unconscious in the front. I couldn't get out, and I was screaming for help." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. She knew this story. She had lived this story. "A stranger stopped," Sarah continued. "A woman. I never knew her name, and I only saw her face for a few minutes in the darkness and smoke. But she pulled me out of that car. She broke the window with something, reached in and cut her hand on the glass trying to unbuckle my seatbelt. That's how I got this scar, from the broken glass when she was pulling me out. She carried me away from the car just before it exploded. My mother died in that fire, but I lived because of this stranger." The courtroom had gone completely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing, caught up in Sarah's story. Margaret's hands were gripping the gavel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "The woman stayed with me," Sarah said. "She held me while I cried and told me everything would be okay. She had kind eyes. I remember that. Brown eyes that seemed warm even though we were sitting in the snow. She kept saying, 'Be brave, sweetheart. Be brave.' She stayed until she heard the sirens coming. And then she left. Just disappeared before the police and ambulance arrived. I never got to thank her. I never got to tell her that she saved my life." Sarah looked directly at Margaret for the first time. "For 25 years I've wondered who she was. I've wanted to find her and tell her that because she saved me that night, I got to grow up. I got to graduate high school. I got to have a daughter of my own. Every good thing in my life exists because of what she did. And now, standing here, about to lose everything, I keep thinking about what she told me. 'Be brave.' I'm trying to be brave now, Your Honor. I'm trying to face the consequences of my actions with the same courage she showed me that night." Margaret felt like she couldn't breathe. The walls of the courtroom seemed to be closing in around her. She remembered that night with perfect clarity, even though she had spent 25 years trying to forget it. December 14, 1999. She had been 22 years old, a second-year law student at Harvard, driving back to campus after a late night at the library. It was snowing heavily, and the roads were treacherous. She had been tired, stressed about finals, thinking about the future she was building for herself. Then she had seen the car, wrapped around a tree, flames already licking up from under the hood. She had stopped without thinking, running through the snow in her inadequate shoes and thin coat. The woman in the front seat was clearly dead, her neck bent at an impossible angle. But in the back, there was a little girl screaming, struggling against her seatbelt, unable to reach the buckle. Margaret had grabbed a rock from the side of the road and smashed the window. She had reached in, ignoring the glass cutting into her hand, and struggled with the seatbelt until it finally released. She had pulled the girl out and carried her away from the car, and they had barely gotten 20 feet before the vehicle exploded in a ball of flame. Margaret had sat in the snow with the little girl holding her, trying to calm her down. The child had been hysterical, crying for her mother, and Margaret had done the only thing she could think of. She had held her close and whispered reassurances. "Be brave, sweetheart. You're going to be okay. Be brave." In the distance, Margaret had heard sirens approaching. Someone else must have called 911. Good. The girl would get help. But Margaret had looked down at her bleeding hand, at the girl's blood on her coat, and had suddenly panicked. She had a major exam the next morning. She was already late getting back to campus. If she stayed, she would have to give a statement to the police, go to the hospital, miss her exam. Everything she had worked for could be jeopardized by this delay. It was a moment of pure selfishness that Margaret had regretted for 25 years. She had laid the little girl gently in the snow, promised her that help was coming, and then she had run back to her car and driven away before the emergency vehicles arrived. She had told herself it was fine, that the girl would be taken care of, that staying wouldn't change anything. But deep down she had known she was being a coward. She had saved the girl's life and then abandoned her to protect her own future. Margaret had never told anyone about that night. She had gone home, bandaged her hand and taken her exam the next morning. She had graduated, gone to law school, built her career. She had checked the news obsessively for weeks afterward, looking for information about the accident. She had learned that a 5-year-old girl named Sarah Mitchell had survived, but her mother, Jennifer Mitchell, had died at the scene. The articles had called the child's survival miraculous, with no mention of the stranger who had pulled her from the car. Margaret had told herself that was for the best. The girl survived. That was all that mattered. She didn't need to know about the woman who had saved her and then run away. Now 25 years later, that little girl was standing in her courtroom, and Margaret had to decide her fate. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Sarah's attorney finally cleared his throat. "Your Honor, if I may, my client's point in sharing this story is to illustrate that she understands the value of second chances. Someone gave her a second chance at life 25 years ago. She's asking the court to give her a second chance now, to be the mother her daughter needs, to make restitution for her crimes, while remaining in her child's life." Margaret realized everyone was waiting for her response. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys. The bailiff was watching her with concern. Sarah stood at the defense table, her scarred arms still exposed, tears streaming down her face. "Miss Mitchell," Margaret heard herself say, her voice sounding strange and distant, "please sit down. I need to take a brief recess." Without waiting for a response, Margaret stood and walked quickly from the courtroom into her chambers. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Her hands were shaking, and she could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool air in the room. She walked to her desk and sank into her chair, staring at her own hands. On her right palm, there was a thin white scar, barely visible after all these years. The scar from that night, from the broken glass when she had reached into the burning car. Margaret had looked at that scar thousands of times over the past 25 years. Sometimes she forgot it was there. Other times it seemed to burn, A physical reminder of the night she had saved a life, and then run away like a coward. Now that little girl was a woman, standing in her courtroom, asking for mercy. The same mercy Margaret had shown her that night, when she had risked her own life to pull her from the flames. But Margaret had also shown cowardice, abandoning Sarah before help arrived. Which version of herself should guide her decision now? The hero who had saved a life, or the coward who had run away? There was a soft knock on the door. "Your Honor?" It was her clerk, David. "Is everything all right? Do you need anything?" "I'm fine," Margaret called back, though her voice betrayed her. "I just need a few minutes." "Of course. Take your time." Margaret stood and walked to the window of her chambers, looking out over the city. She had spent 15 years on this bench, making difficult decisions, weighing evidence, applying the law with precision and fairness. She had prided herself on being impartial, on never letting personal feelings influence her judgments. But this wasn't about impartiality anymore. This was about a debt she had never acknowledged, a connection she had denied for 25 years. Sarah Mitchell was asking for a second chance, just as Margaret had given her a second chance at life all those years ago. But the law was clear. Embezzlement was a serious crime. $75,000 wasn't a small amount. Sarah had pleaded guilty. The sentencing guidelines were explicit. If Margaret showed leniency now, was she being merciful, or was she compromising her integrity to protect a secret? Margaret thought about Sarah's daughter, Emma, 5 years old, just like Sarah had been on that snowy night in 1999. A little girl who had already fought for her life against leukemia and won. If Margaret sent Sarah to prison, Emma would grow up visiting her mother in a correctional facility, carrying the stigma of having a criminal parent, potentially ending up in foster care if there were no other family members available. But if Margaret showed mercy, was she sending a message that stealing was acceptable if you had a sympathetic enough reason? How many other defendants had she sentenced who had sick children, mounting debts, desperate circumstances? Why should Sarah Mitchell get special treatment just because Margaret happened to be the stranger who saved her life 25 years ago? The answer, Margaret realized with painful clarity, was that Sarah shouldn't get special treatment, but she also shouldn't be punished more harshly because of Margaret's guilt and fear. What Margaret needed to do was make the decision she would have made if she didn't know about that night, if she didn't carry the weight of that scar on her palm. She needed to judge Sarah Mitchell's case on its merits, not on the secrets of her own past. Margaret took a deep breath and returned to the courtroom. Everyone rose as she entered, and she could feel the tension in the air. Sarah was still sitting at the defense table, her eyes red from crying. Her attorney looked worried, probably wondering if his client's emotional testimony had backfired. Margaret sat down and organized the papers in front of her, buying herself a few more seconds to compose her thoughts. Then she looked directly at Sarah. "Miss Mitchell, thank you for sharing your story with the court. I appreciate your honesty about both your crime and your circumstances." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I want to be very clear about something," Margaret continued. "The fact that you survived a terrible tragedy 25 years ago does not excuse the crime you committed. The fact that you have a sick child does not justify stealing $75,000 from your employer. The law cannot bend every time someone has a sympathetic story, or there would be no law at all." Sarah's face crumpled, and her attorney put a supportive hand on her shoulder. Margaret could see that Sarah thought she knew what was coming. Prison. Years away from her daughter. The ultimate price for her desperation. However, Margaret said, and Sarah's head snapped up, the law also recognizes that justice is not only about punishment, it's also about rehabilitation, restitution, and the protection of society. Miss Mitchell, you have pleaded guilty to your crime. You have shown genuine remorse. You have no prior criminal record, and your crime, while serious, was motivated by a parent's desperate attempt to save her child's life, not by greed or malice. Margaret could feel her own heart pounding as she spoke. She was walking a tightrope, trying to be fair to Sarah while not revealing the connection between them. Most importantly, you have a 5-year-old daughter who needs her mother. Emma Mitchell is an innocent victim in this situation, and while I cannot base my sentence solely on her needs, I cannot ignore them either. Margaret took a breath and delivered her decision. Therefore, I am sentencing you to 2 years in prison with 18 months suspended. You will serve 6 months in a minimum security facility, followed by 4 years of probation, During your probation, you will make full restitution to your former employer through a payment plan to be determined by the probation office. You will also complete 500 hours of community service. This sentence balances the seriousness of your crime with the mitigating circumstances of your case and the needs of your child. The courtroom erupted in a flurry of reactions. Sarah's attorney was trying to hide his surprise and relief. The prosecutor looked annoyed but not angry enough to object. Sarah herself had collapsed into her chair, sobbing with what looked like a mixture of relief and residual fear. 6 months was still a significant sentence, but it was far less than the 4 years the prosecution had requested. And with good behavior, Sarah would likely serve even less time. She would be home with Emma before her daughter turned 6. Margaret banged her gavel once. This court is adjourned. She stood and walked quickly from the courtroom, not waiting to see the aftermath of her decision. Back in her chambers, Margaret sat at her desk and put her head in her hands. She had done what she thought was right, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed a line. Had she given Sarah a lighter sentence because of their connection? Would she have made the same decision for another defendant in the same circumstances? She honestly didn't know. There was a knock on her door, and David poked his head in. "Your Honor, Miss Mitchell's attorney would like to speak with you if you have a moment." Margaret's first instinct was to refuse, but something made her nod. "Send him in." James Rodriguez entered the chambers, looking both grateful and slightly uncomfortable. "Your Honor, I just wanted to thank you for your decision. I know it wasn't easy, and I want you to know that Sarah Mitchell is genuinely grateful for the second chance you've given her." Margaret nodded stiffly. "Mr. Rodriguez, I gave Miss Mitchell a sentence that was appropriate for her crime and circumstances. No thanks are necessary." "Of course, Your Honor, but I also wanted to mention something. After the hearing, Sarah asked me to give you this." He held out a small envelope. "She said it was important, and she hoped you would read it." Margaret hesitated, then took the envelope. "Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. That will be all." After the attorney left, Margaret sat alone in her chambers for a long time, staring at the envelope. Finally, she opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in handwriting. "Dear Judge Thompson," the letter began. "I don't know if you're the woman who saved me 25 years ago. I don't even know if you remember that night. But when you came back into the courtroom after the recess, I saw your hands gripping the bench and I noticed a scar on your right palm. A thin white scar that looked like it might have come from broken glass. And I realized that maybe, just maybe, you're her. The woman with kind eyes who told me to be brave." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Sarah knew, or at least she suspected. "If you are her," the letter continued, "I want you to know that you don't owe me anything. You saved my life that night, and that's more than anyone could ever ask for. You don't need to give me special treatment or feel guilty about anything. I'm grateful for whatever sentence you decided was fair, because I trust that you're a good person who makes good decisions. The same kind of good person who would stop on a snowy highway to save a stranger's child. If you're not her," Sarah's letter went on, "then please forgive me for assuming. But either way, thank you for seeing me as more than just a criminal today. Thank you for considering my daughter's needs. Thank you for giving me a chance to be a better person than I've been. I promise I will use this second chance wisely. I will be the mother Emma deserves. I will pay back every penny I stole. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the mercy you showed me today." The letter was signed simply, "With gratitude, Sarah Mitchell." Margaret read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Sarah knew. She had figured it out from the scar on Margaret's hand, the same scar Sarah bore on her arm. 2 women, bound together by broken glass and split-second decisions made on a night that had changed both their lives forever. Margaret pulled out a piece of her personal stationery and began to write. "Dear Sarah, yes, it was me. 25 years ago, I pulled you from that car and then I ran away before help arrived. I've regretted leaving you that night for my entire adult life. I told myself it was okay because you survived. But the truth is that I was a coward who put my own concerns ahead of making sure you were truly safe." Margaret paused, considering how honest she wanted to be. Then she continued. "Today in court, I tried to make a decision based on the law and the facts of your case, not on our connection. I hope I succeeded. I hope the sentence I gave you was fair and appropriate. But I also want you to know that seeing you today, seeing the strong woman you've become, despite the tragedy you suffered as a child, gave me peace I didn't know I was searching for. You asked me to be brave that night, And you've proven that you took those words to heart. Now I'm asking you to do the same. Be brave as you face the next 6 months. Be brave as you work to rebuild your life. Be brave for Emma, who needs her mother to show her what true courage looks like. You don't owe me gratitude, Margaret wrote. If anything, I owe you an apology for abandoning you that night. But maybe we can call it even. You've given me the gift of knowing that saving you mattered, that it changed your life in positive ways. That's worth more than you can imagine. I wish you nothing but the best for your future. Be brave, Sarah. You always have been. Sincerely, Margaret Thompson. Margaret sealed the letter in an envelope and asked David to have it delivered to Sarah's attorney. Then she sat back in her chair and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the day's events. For 25 years, she had carried the secret of that night like a stone in her chest. She had built walls around herself, convinced that letting anyone know about her moment of cowardice would destroy everything she had worked to become. But today, the secret had come out, and the world hadn't ended. Instead, something unexpected had happened. She had been forced to confront the contradiction at the heart of her life. She was both a hero and a coward, both brave and afraid, both someone who saved lives, and someone who ran away from the consequences. And somehow, facing that truth hadn't destroyed her. It had made her more human. Over the following weeks, Margaret thought often about Sarah, and that night 25 years ago. She followed the case through the system, making sure Sarah was placed in a minimum security facility close to her daughter's foster home. She learned through the probation reports that Sarah was a model prisoner, working in the facility's library, and taking business ethics courses. She read updates about Emma, who was thriving with her temporary foster family, and visiting her mother twice a week. 6 months passed. Margaret had other cases, other defendants, other decisions to make, but she never forgot about Sarah Mitchell. On the day of Sarah's release, Margaret did something she had never done before. She left the courthouse early and drove to the correctional facility where Sarah was being released. She parked across the street and watched as Sarah walked out through the gates, carrying a small bag of belongings. Emma was there waiting with her foster mother, and the little girl ran to Sarah with such pure joy that Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. Sarah scooped up her daughter and held her like she would never let go, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. Margaret watched this reunion from a distance, and she felt something shift inside her chest. The stone she had carried for 25 years was gone, replaced by something lighter, something that felt almost like peace. She didn't approach them. This moment belonged to Sarah and Emma, not to her. Instead, she started her car and drove home, feeling for the first time in decades that she had truly done the right thing. 3 years later, Margaret was in her chambers when David brought in the morning mail. Among the usual court documents and legal notices was a thick envelope with familiar handwriting. Margaret opened it to find a letter from Sarah and several photographs. "Dear Judge Thompson," the letter began, "I hope you don't mind me writing to you. I know it's probably not appropriate to contact a judge who sentenced you, but I had to let you know how things have turned out. I completed my probation last month. I paid back every penny I stole, plus interest. It took 3 years of working 2 jobs and living in a tiny apartment, but I did it. My former employers even hired me back part-time to help with their bookkeeping, which meant more to me than I can express. Emma is 8 years old now, and thriving. She's healthy, happy, and has no memory of the time I was away. I've told her about my crime and my punishment in age-appropriate ways, because I don't want her to grow up thinking her mother is perfect. I want her to know that people make mistakes, and that what matters is how you recover from them." Sarah's letter continued with updates about her life, her work, her daughter's achievements in school. Then at the end, she wrote something that made Margaret's breath catch. "I also wanted to tell you that I've started volunteering with an organization that helps families dealing with medical debt. I counsel people about their options, help them navigate insurance systems, and most importantly, I tell them my story. I tell them what desperation can drive you to do, and I help them find legal ways to get the help they need. In the past year, I've helped 15 families avoid the kind of mistake I made. Every time I help someone find a legitimate solution to their problems, I think about you. I think about how you gave me a second chance, even though you didn't have to. I think about how mercy can be just as powerful as punishment, and maybe more effective at creating real change. I also think about that night 25 years ago," Sarah wrote. "I think about a young woman who stopped her car in a snowstorm and risked her life to save a stranger's child. I think about how she could have just driven by, how no one would have blamed her for not stopping, but she did anyway. That act of courage has rippled through my entire life. Because she saved me, I got to live. Because I got to live, I had a daughter. Because I had a daughter, I fought to stay in her life. Because I fought to stay in her life, I learned to be a better person. And because I became a better person, I can now help others avoid the mistakes I made. One act of courage, 25 years ago, has created all of this good. I hope you understand what that means. I hope you understand that even though you left before the ambulance came, even though you might have regrets about that night, what you did mattered. It mattered then, and it still matters now. The letter was signed, "With eternal gratitude, Sarah Mitchell." Enclosed with the letter were photographs. Emma at her 8th birthday party, blowing out candles on a cake. Sarah at her former workplace, shaking hands with her old boss. Sarah and Emma together, both of them smiling at the camera with the same bright, hopeful expressions. And one more photograph that made Margaret's breath stop. It showed Sarah speaking to a room full of people, clearly giving a presentation. On the screen behind her was projected a photograph Margaret recognized. It was the newspaper clipping from that night, in 1999, the one that showed the burned-out car and mentioned the mysterious stranger who had saved a child's life. The presentation title read, "Second Chances: How One Act of Courage Changed Everything." Margaret sat at her desk, holding these photographs, and for the first time in 25 years, she allowed herself to fully remember that night, not with guilt or regret, but with acceptance. Yes, she had run away. Yes, she had put her own concerns ahead of staying to make sure Sarah was safe. Those things were true, and they were part of her story. But it was also true that she had stopped. She had run into the fire. She had pulled a little girl from certain death. She had done something brave and selfless, even if it was imperfect, even if she had been scared, even if she had run away afterward. That night had shaped both of their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. Sarah had learned to be brave in the face of tragedy. Margaret had built a career trying to balance justice and mercy, and now, 25 years later, they had both learned that sometimes the most important thing isn't whether you're perfect. It's whether you try. It's whether you stop when you see someone who needs help. Even if you're scared. Even if you make mistakes. Even if you don't do everything right. It's whether you give people second chances when they deserve them. It's whether you believe in redemption and transformation, not just punishment. Margaret pulled out a piece of stationery and began to write back. "Dear Sarah, thank you for your letter and the photographs. I'm incredibly proud of the woman you've become, and the life you've built for yourself and Emma. Your work helping other families is a perfect example of how one person's mistakes can be transformed into wisdom that helps others. I want to tell you something I've never told anyone. For 25 years I've carried guilt about leaving you that night. I convinced myself that because you survived, my cowardice didn't matter. But it did matter. It mattered to me. It shaped every decision I've made since then, including the decision I made in my courtroom 3 years ago when you stood before me. I gave you a second chance not just because it was the right legal decision, but because I believed in second chances. I believed in them because I had needed one myself, even if no one knew it but me. You say that my act of courage has rippled through your life, creating good that continues to this day. I want you to know that your courage has done the same for me. Watching you take responsibility for your mistakes, rebuild your life, and turn your pain into purpose has shown me what true strength looks like. You've taught me that being brave isn't about being fearless or perfect. It's about facing your mistakes, accepting the consequences, and choosing to become better despite the difficulty. I'm writing to you not as a judge, but as the woman who pulled you from that car 25 years ago. Margaret continued. I want to say something I should have said that night, but didn't have the courage to express. I'm proud of you. I'm proud of the little girl who survived such a terrible tragedy. I'm proud of the woman who loved her daughter enough to do whatever it took to save her, even if it meant making terrible mistakes. I'm proud of the mother who faced the consequences of those mistakes with grace and determination. And I'm proud of the person you've become, someone who takes her pain and turns it into help for others. That night in the snow I told you to be brave. You've done that and so much more. You've shown me what it means to truly live with courage. Thank you for that gift. With admiration and respect, Margaret. Margaret mailed the letter and returned to her work, but something had shifted in her. She found herself being more thoughtful in her sentencing decisions, considering not just the crimes people had committed, but the circumstances that had led them there and the possibilities for their redemption. She started volunteering with a legal aid organization that helped low-income families navigate medical debt. She became known among her colleagues for her thoughtful approach to difficult cases, balancing the requirements of law with the realities of human struggle. And on December 14th every year, the anniversary of that night in 1999, Margaret would drive to the spot where the accident had happened. The tree was long gone, removed by the highway department years ago. There was no memorial, no marker to show that anything significant had happened there. But Margaret would stand on the side of the road for a few minutes, remembering the snow, the fire, the little girl's cries, and she would whisper the same words she had said that night: "Be brave." 5 years after Sarah's release from prison, Margaret received an unexpected phone call at her chambers. It was Sarah, and her voice was excited but nervous. "Judge Thompson, I hope it's okay that I'm calling. I have something important to ask you, and I wanted to do it personally." "Of course, Sarah, what can I do for you?" "Emma turns 10 next month, and I'm planning a special birthday party for her. It's a milestone, and I want her to understand how lucky we are to have each other. I've told her bits and pieces of our story over the years, but I think she's old enough now to hear the full truth. I'd like to introduce her to you, to tell her that you're the woman who saved my life, and that in a way you saved hers too." Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Sarah, I would be honored." "There's more," Sarah continued. "I've been working with that organization I mentioned, the one that helps families with medical debt. We've decided to establish a scholarship fund for children of single parents who are facing financial hardship. We want to call it the Second Chances Scholarship, and I was hoping you would agree to be on our board of directors." Margaret was silent for a moment, processing this request. For 25 years she had kept her connection to Sarah Mitchell a secret, believing that revealing it would somehow compromise her integrity as a judge. But Sarah was asking her to step out of the shadows, to acknowledge their connection publicly, to turn their shared history into something that could help others. "I would be honored to serve on your board," Margaret said finally, "and I would love to meet Emma." 2 weeks later, Margaret drove to a community center in a modest neighborhood outside Boston. The building was decorated with balloons and streamers for Emma's birthday party. Inside, she found a room full of children playing games, parents chatting, and in the center of it all, Sarah Mitchell looking radiant and confident in a way Margaret had never seen before. When Sarah spotted Margaret, she excused herself from the conversation she was having, and came over immediately. "Judge Thompson, you came. Thank you so much. Please call me Margaret. I think we're past formalities, don't you?" Sarah smiled and led Margaret across the room to where a young girl was opening presents. Emma Mitchell was beautiful, with dark hair like her mother's and eyes that sparkled with intelligence and joy. She looked nothing like the sick toddler Sarah had described from her cancer treatments. This was a healthy, happy child who clearly felt loved and secure. "Emma, sweetheart," Sarah said gently, "there's someone I'd like you to meet. This is Margaret Thompson. She's a very special person in our lives." Emma looked up at Margaret with open curiosity. "Mom told me about you. You're the judge who helped her, right?" "I did what I thought was right," Margaret said, kneeling down to Emma's level. "But your mother did all the hard work herself. Mom also told me you saved her life when she was little. Like me," Emma continued. "In a car accident." Margaret glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. This was the moment of truth. The moment when Margaret would either acknowledge her role in that night, or deflect the question. She looked at Emma's earnest face, and made her choice. "Yes," Margaret said. "A long time ago when your mother was just 5 years old, the same age you were when she was in court, I found her in a very scary situation. I helped her get to safety, and I'm so glad I did, because it meant she got to grow up and become your mom." Emma's eyes widened. "Wow, so if you hadn't helped her, I wouldn't be here." "That's right," Margaret said softly. "So in a way, by helping your mother, I got to help you too, even though you weren't born yet." Emma thought about this for a moment, then threw her arms around Margaret's neck in an impulsive hug. "Thank you for saving my mom. She's the best mom in the world." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes as she hugged the little girl back. Over Emma's shoulder, she saw Sarah watching with tears streaming down her own face. This moment, This simple expression of gratitude from a child who existed because of choices made long ago felt like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. After Emma ran off to play with her friends, Sarah and Margaret stood together, watching the party. "She doesn't know all the details," Sarah said quietly. "She knows I made mistakes and went away for a while when she was little, but I've framed it in ways she can understand at her age. As she gets older, I'll tell her more. I want her to know the truth, but I also want her to know that people can change, that mistakes don't define you forever." "You've done an incredible job with her," Margaret said. "She's clearly a happy, confident child. That's a testament to your strength as a mother." "I couldn't have done it without you," Sarah said. "Without the second chance you gave me, a lot of judges wouldn't have shown mercy. They would have sent me away for years, and Emma would have grown up in foster care. You saved my life twice, Margaret. Once when I was 5, and once when I was 30. "I like to think I just saw what was already there," Margaret replied. "You had the strength and determination all along. I just gave you the opportunity to prove it." They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching Emma laugh with her friends, completely unaware of the complicated history that had brought her to this moment. Then Sarah turned to Margaret with a serious expression. "There's something else I need to tell you. Something I've been working on in secret for the past year." Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness. "What is it?" "Do you remember how I mentioned starting a scholarship fund? Well, it's bigger than I let on. I've been working with several organizations, and we've raised over $200,000. We're going to help 50 families this year alone. But I realized that the scholarship needed more than just money. It needed a story, a face, something that would help people understand why second chances matter." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Margaret a website. The homepage featured 2 photographs side by side. On the left was the newspaper clipping from 1999, showing the burned-out car. On the right was a current photo of Sarah and Emma, both smiling at the camera. Between the photos was text that read, "From tragedy to triumph, how one woman's courage created a legacy of hope." "I've written a book," Sarah said. "It tells our whole story, from the accident to my crime to my redemption. And it talks about you, Margaret. It talks about the woman who saved my life, and then gave me a second chance when I desperately needed one. It talks about how one person's decision to stop on a snowy highway can change the trajectory of multiple lives." Margaret felt her heart racing. "Sarah, I don't know if I'm comfortable with this level of publicity. I'm a judge. There are ethical considerations. People might question my impartiality if they know about our connection." "I understand," Sarah said quickly. "That's why I haven't published it yet. I wanted to talk to you first, to get your permission to tell the full story. If you're not comfortable with it, I'll take you out entirely. I'll just say it was an anonymous stranger. But Margaret, I think our story could help so many people. It could show that judges are human, that mercy and justice can coexist, that giving people second chances isn't weakness, it's wisdom." Margaret was quiet for a long time, wrestling with her instinct to protect her privacy against the possibility that their story could indeed help others. She thought about all the defendants she had sentenced over the years, all the difficult decisions she had made, all the times she had wondered if she was being too harsh or too lenient. She thought about the stone she had carried in her chest for 25 years, the guilt and shame of running away that night, and she thought about how, through an impossible series of circumstances, that guilt had been transformed into something beautiful. A woman who had survived, a child who had been saved from a life of poverty or foster care, a scholarship fund that would help dozens of families, a story that could inspire others to believe in redemption and change. "Tell the story," Margaret said finally. "Tell all of it, the good and the bad, the courage and the cowardice, the crime and the redemption. If our story can help even one person believe that change is possible, then it's worth whatever discomfort it might cause me." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. "I've spent 25 years hiding from what happened that night. It's time to stop hiding and start helping." The book was published 6 months later. Second Chances, A Judge, a Defendant, and The Night That Changed Everything became a regional bestseller. Margaret was interviewed by local news stations and national podcasts. Some of her judicial colleagues expressed concern about the ethical implications of her relationship with Sarah, but most were supportive, understanding that Margaret had made a difficult decision and had been transparent about it afterward. The publicity brought unexpected benefits. The Second Chances Scholarship Fund received donations from across the country. Hundreds of families reached out for help with medical debt and financial crises. And perhaps most importantly, the story started a conversation about justice, mercy, and the role of empathy in the legal system. Margaret received letters from defense attorneys, thanking her for showing that judges could consider the whole person, not just the crime. She heard from former defendants who said her story had inspired them to believe that their mistakes didn't have to define their futures. She even received a letter from the prosecutor who had handled Sarah's case, admitting that he had initially thought her sentence was too lenient, but now understood the wisdom of giving Sarah a chance to rebuild her life while being held accountable for her actions. 1 year after the book's publication, Margaret was invited to speak at Harvard Law School, her alma mater. The auditorium was packed with law students, professors and practicing attorneys, all eager to hear her perspective on the intersection of justice and mercy. Margaret stood at the podium, looking out at the eager young faces, and saw herself at their age. Ambitious, idealistic, certain that the law was a clear-cut system of right and wrong, rules and consequences. She knew better now. 26 years ago, Margaret began. I was sitting where you are now. I was a second-year law student, convinced that I understood justice, convinced that the law was a perfect system that just needed to be applied correctly. Then one night, I stopped on a snowy highway and pulled a little girl from a burning car. In that moment, I learned that justice isn't just about following rules, it's about recognizing our common humanity and making choices that honor the value of every human life. She told them about Sarah, about the crime and the sentencing, about the impossible position she had found herself in when she realized the defendant was the child she had saved. She told them about the decision she had made and the reasoning behind it. And then she told them something she had been thinking about for months. Some people have asked me if I would make the same decision today, knowing what controversy it would cause, knowing how it would be scrutinized and debated. My answer is yes, absolutely yes. Because that decision wasn't just about Sarah Mitchell, it was about every defendant who stands before a judge, hoping to be seen as more than just their worst mistake. It was about the purpose of our justice system, which should be not just to punish wrongdoing, but to create opportunities for people to become better than they were. Sarah Mitchell stole $75,000 to save her daughter's life. She was wrong to do so, and she paid for that crime with time in prison, years of probation, and full restitution. But she was also a mother who would have done anything to save her child. She was a woman who had survived trauma and hardship. She was a human being who deserved to be seen in her full complexity, not reduced to a single bad decision. Margaret paused and looked around the auditorium. As future lawyers and judges, you will have the power to make decisions that shape people's lives. You will interpret laws, argue cases, render verdicts. But I'm asking you to remember that behind every case file is a human story. Behind every crime is a person who made choices, sometimes terrible choices, but who also has the capacity to change, to grow, to become better. The law is important. Rules and consequences matter. But so does mercy, so does compassion, so does the recognition that we are all flawed human beings who have made mistakes, and we are all capable of redemption if given the chance. The speech received a standing ovation. Afterward, dozens of students lined up to thank Margaret and ask questions. Many of them had their own stories of mercy shown or withheld, of second chances given or denied. One young woman, a third-year law student, waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching Margaret. Judge Thompson, I wanted to thank you for sharing your story. My mother was incarcerated when I was 10 years old. She served 3 years for drug possession and theft. The judge who sentenced her gave her a chance to go to rehab instead of the maximum sentence, and it saved her life. She's been clean for 12 years now, and she got to see me graduate college and start law school. If that judge had thrown the book at her, I would have grown up in foster care, and I probably wouldn't be standing here today. The student paused, tears in her eyes. Your story reminded me that judges are human beings who make difficult choices. It reminded me that showing mercy isn't weakness, it's strength. And it inspired me to want to be the kind of lawyer who fights for people like my mom. People who made mistakes but deserve a chance to prove they can change. Margaret hugged the young woman, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with telling her story publicly. But she also felt the rightness of it. The sense that by being honest about her own struggle with justice and mercy, she was giving others permission to wrestle with the same questions. 10 years after Sarah's sentencing, Margaret received an invitation to another milestone event. Sarah and the Second Chances Foundation were hosting a gala to celebrate 10 years of helping families in crisis. The invitation included a personal note from Sarah. "Margaret, we've helped over 500 families in the past decade. We've prevented countless crimes by giving people legal alternatives to desperation. We've kept families together. We've given children like Emma the chance to grow up with their parents. None of this would have existed without you. Please come celebrate with us and see what your courage has created." The gala was held at a beautiful hotel in downtown Boston. Margaret arrived to find hundreds of people in attendance. Former scholarship recipients, families the foundation had helped, donors and volunteers all gathered to celebrate the impact of the Second Chances Foundation. Sarah found Margaret almost immediately and pulled her into a warm hug. At 39 years old, Sarah looked confident and accomplished, a far cry from the desperate woman who had stood in Margaret's courtroom a decade earlier. "Margaret, I'm so glad you're here. There's someone I want you to meet." She led Margaret through the crowd to where Emma was standing. At 15, Emma had grown into a beautiful young woman with her mother's determination and resilience. But she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was an older woman in a wheelchair, and Margaret felt her breath catch when she recognized her. "Margaret," Sarah said softly, "this is Barbara Chen. She was one of the paramedics who responded to my accident 26 years ago. She's the one who found me in the snow after you left, who stayed with me in the ambulance, who made sure I got to the hospital safely." Barbara looked up at Margaret with kind eyes that had seen decades of tragedy and triumph. "So you're the mystery woman. I've been wondering about you for 26 years. When we arrived at the scene, little Sarah kept crying about the lady with kind eyes who had saved her and told her to be brave. We searched for you, but you were gone. I always wondered who you were and why you left." Margaret felt shame wash over her, even after all these years. "I was young and scared. I had an important exam the next morning, and I panicked. I convinced myself that Sarah would be fine without me, that staying wouldn't change anything. I was wrong. I should have stayed." "Actually," Barbara said with a gentle smile, "you did exactly what you needed to do. If you had stayed, you would have been caught up in the investigation for hours. You would have missed your exam, and you might not have gone on to become Judge Thompson, the woman who would save Sarah's life a second time 25 years later." Barbara reached out and took Margaret's hand. "I've been a paramedic for 40 years. I've seen thousands of accident scenes, and I can tell you that most people don't stop at all. They drive past, not wanting to get involved, convincing themselves that someone else will help. But you stopped. You ran into danger. You saved a child's life. The fact that you left afterward doesn't erase that courage. It just makes you human." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. For 26 years, she had focused on her cowardice in leaving, never fully acknowledging the courage it had taken to stop in the first place. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. "I didn't know I needed to hear that, but I did." The gala continued with speeches and presentations. Sarah took the stage and told their story to the assembled crowd, showing before and after photographs, statistics about the foundation's impact, and testimonials from families they had helped. Then she said something that made Margaret's heart swell with pride. "But the real story isn't just about one judge showing mercy to one defendant. It's about what happens when we all decide to see each other as human beings deserving of second chances. It's about what happens when we transform our mistakes into wisdom that can help others. It's about what happens when we stop running from our past and start using it to build a better future." Sarah gestured to Emma, who joined her on stage. "This is my daughter Emma. She's 15 years old, healthy, and thriving. She wants to become a lawyer so she can help people like her mom, people who made mistakes, but deserve a chance to make things right. Emma exists because of a chain of choices made by brave people." Margaret Thompson stopped on a highway. "Barbara Chen stayed with me in the ambulance. Judge Thompson gave me a second chance, and I chose to use that chance to become someone my daughter could be proud of." Emma took the microphone, and her voice was clear and confident. "I'm standing here tonight because of a stranger's courage 26 years ago. I'm standing here because of a judge's wisdom 10 years ago. I'm standing here because of my mom's determination every day since then. But I'm also standing here because I believe that all of us have the power to change someone's life. We just have to be brave enough to stop when we see someone who needs help." We just have to be wise enough to look beyond someone's mistakes and see their potential. We just have to be determined enough to keep trying, even when it's hard. The crowd rose in a standing ovation. Margaret found herself crying openly, surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the ripple effects of one choice made on a snowy night 26 years ago. After the event, Margaret, Sarah, Emma, and Barbara sat together in a quiet corner of the hotel lobby. 4 generations of women, connected by tragedy and triumph, reflecting on how their lives had intertwined. "I have a question," Emma said, looking at Margaret with curious eyes. "Do you ever regret stopping that night? Like knowing all the complicated stuff that came afterward? The guilt you felt, the difficult decision in court, all of it. Do you ever wish you had just driven past?" Margaret thought carefully before answering. "No," she said finally. "Not for a single second. Everything that happened afterward, both the difficult parts and the beautiful parts, they all stem from that one choice to stop. Yes, I made mistakes. Yes, I felt guilt. Yes, the situation put me in an impossible position years later. But Emma, look at you. Look at your mother. Look at this foundation and all the families it's helped. All of this exists because I stopped. How could I possibly regret that?" "That's what I thought," Emma said with a satisfied smile. "Because that's what I want to do with my life. I want to be someone who stops when other people drive past. I want to be someone who gives second chances. I want to be someone who helps turn mistakes into opportunities for change." Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand, her eyes shining with tears. "You already are that person, sweetheart. You already are." Barbara spoke up, her voice raspy with age but still strong. "I've been thinking about writing a book about all the accident scenes I've responded to over the years, the patterns I've seen, the choices people make in crisis, the aftermath of tragedy. Would you all be willing to let me tell your story as the centerpiece? I think it perfectly illustrates how one moment of courage can create ripples that spread for decades. Only if you call it be brave," Margaret said with a smile. "That's what I told Sarah that night, and it's become the theme of all our lives since then." "Be brave," Barbara repeated, testing the title. "I like it. Simple but powerful. Just like the message." They sat together for another hour, sharing stories and memories, laughing and crying, marveling at the improbable ways their lives had woven together. When they finally said their goodbyes, Margaret hugged each of them tightly, grateful for the role they had played in helping her understand that courage and cowardice aren't opposites. They're often intertwined, existing in the same person, sometimes in the same moment. What matters isn't being perfect. What matters is trying. It's stopping when you see someone who needs help. It's making difficult decisions with wisdom and compassion. It's using your mistakes and regrets as fuel for growth, rather than letting them define you. Margaret drove home that night, thinking about the mysterious nature of impact. How can we ever know the full consequences of our choices? How can we predict which small decisions will echo through decades, touching lives we'll never meet, creating futures we can't imagine? The answer, she realized, is that we can't know. We can only choose to act with courage and compassion in the moments we're given, trusting that even our flawed and imperfect efforts might somehow create good we'll never see. 26 years ago, Margaret Thompson stopped on a snowy highway and saved a little girl's life. That choice had cost her sleep, peace of mind, and years of carrying secret guilt. But it had also given the world Sarah Mitchell, a woman who had transformed her mistakes into a mission to help others. It had given the world Emma Mitchell, a young woman committed to justice and mercy. It had given the world the Second Chances Foundation, which had helped hundreds of families avoid desperation and crime. And it had given Margaret herself a deeper understanding of what it means to be human, flawed and brave, cowardly and courageous, all at the same time. As Margaret prepared for bed that night, she looked at the thin white scar on her right palm, barely visible after all these years. She used to see that scar as a mark of shame, a reminder of the night she had been brave and then run away. Now she saw it differently. Now it was a reminder that courage doesn't require perfection. It just requires trying. It requires stopping when others drive past, even if you're scared, even if you make mistakes afterward, even if you don't do everything right. The scar was proof that she had tried, and in the end, trying had been enough. More than enough. It had been everything. Dear viewers, sometimes the most important thing we can do is stop when we see someone who needs help. Judge Margaret Thompson taught us that courage doesn't require perfection, just action. She saved a little girl's life, and then spent 26 years learning that her moment of cowardice afterward didn't erase her moment of bravery. Sarah Mitchell taught us that our mistakes don't define us unless we let them. She made terrible choices in desperate circumstances, and she spent years making amends, transforming her shame into a mission to help others avoid her fate. Emma Mitchell is teaching us that the next generation can learn from both our courage and our mistakes. She's choosing a path of justice and mercy, inspired by women who showed her what real strength looks like. This story reminds us that one choice can ripple through decades, touching lives in ways we never anticipate. The stranger you help today might become the person who changes the world tomorrow. The mercy you show might inspire someone else to show mercy. The second chance you give might create a legacy that outlives you. What choice will you make today? Will you stop when others drive past? Will you show mercy when the rules tell you to be harsh? Will you believe in someone's capacity to change even when they've made terrible mistakes? These are the questions Judge Thompson faced on a snowy night 26 years ago, and again in her courtroom 10 years later. These are the questions we all face every day, and the answers we choose create the world we live in. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, be brave. You never know how far your courage will ripple.